The turkey. It wasn't chosen for beauty or grace. The turkey was wild, unpredictable, and nearly impossible to tame. Long before it became the centerpiece of a polished dinner table, it was a symbol of survival. Native tribes hunted it with reverence, not excess. Its feathers decorated sacred garments, its presence fed communities through harsh winters. To them, it wasn't just food, it was life given and received in balance. When the pilgrims arrived, the bird carried a different meaning. They saw in it not just sustenance, but providence. In their eyes, the turkey became a living sermon, a creature God placed in their wilderness to prove that provision follows obedience. When they had nothing left, creation itself fed them. The table they built around it was an altar of gratitude, not luxury. Over time, America adopted the turkey as its national symbol of Thanksgiving. But with that came distortion. What began as a prayer of survival turned into an image of excess. The feast that once pointed upward now too often points inward. We celebrate the abundance but forget the wilderness it came from. Still, the meaning remains, quietly waiting under the noise of parades and football games. The turkey is not a symbol of consumption, but of divine care. It reminds us that every gift is sacred when it is received with gratitude, not entitlement. What do you think? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes the truest worship isn't in the hymns we sing, but in the meals we remember, and the grace that found us when we were hungry. The cornucopia. We picture it every year, the horn-spilling fruit, bread, and wheat in endless plenty, but few remember where it began. The cornucopia was once a Greek myth, born from the story of Amalthea, the goat who nursed the infant god Zeus. When her horn broke, legend said it would forever pour abundance to whoever possessed it. It was the world's first symbol of never-ending supply. Centuries later, that myth crossed oceans and cultures, but something in it remained familiar. The shape of the horn, open, overflowing, generous, found new meaning in faith. Early Christians saw it not as magic, but as metaphor. The horn of plenty became the vessel of blessing. God's provision pouring out without end. What pagan story called fate, they renamed as grace. Yet as time passed, the symbol changed again. Its divine center was replaced by decoration. It moved from altars to storefronts, from sacred reminder to seasonal prop. The horn that once told stories of miraculous provision now sits empty of its voice, its meaning buried beneath plastic fruit and polished tables. But still, the cornucopia whispers. Its shape invites the same truth, that the real source of abundance isn't what we gather, it's who gives it. The horn reminds us that blessings are not earned, they overflow. If that image stirs you, write, "I remember the source," in the comments below. Because Thanksgiving isn't about what spills from the horn, it's about the unseen hand that keeps filling it. Pumpkin pie. It smells like comfort, the warmth of cinnamon, nutmeg, and sugar rising from the oven, but the first Thanksgiving had no such sweetness. There was no pie, no sugar, no ovens. The settlers had pumpkins, yes, but they roasted them whole, hollowed them out, and filled them with milk and honey if they had any left. What we now serve as dessert began as desperation. Pumpkin pie was born from scarcity. It was the story of people who had almost nothing, turning what they did have into something worth sharing. Over generations, that act became a symbol. That sweetness can grow from struggle and joy can emerge from lack. The settlers didn't bake comfort, they made meaning. Later, as America grew wealthier, the pie evolved. It left the fire pit and found its place on polished tables, decorated with whipped cream and nostalgia. But in doing so, we often lost the lesson baked inside it. The pie was never about indulgence, it was about transformation. God's quiet miracle of turning bitter soil into fruit, hunger into gratitude, grief into gladness. And maybe that's why it still tastes like peace. Because every slice carries an echo of the psalmist's words, "You have turned my mourning into dancing." The sweetness reminds us that joy is not the absence of hardship. It's the harvest that follows it. What do you think? Could the simplest dessert be the most honest prayer? Because the true flavor of Thanksgiving isn't sugar. It's grace remembered in every bite. Corn and wheat, they look simple. Golden fields swaying in the wind, but corn and wheat were once seen as divine gifts. Long before anyone called it Thanksgiving, people bowed before the harvest. To ancient farmers, these grains weren't just crops. They were prayers answered. In Scripture, wheat was sacred. It filled the storehouses of Egypt, sustained Israel in famine, and became the image Jesus used to describe his own death and resurrection. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Corn carried its own meaning. Life multiplied, joy gathered from the earth. Together they told a single story, that every harvest begins in surrender. When early settlers placed corn and wheat on their tables, they weren't displaying abundance. They were remembering the mystery of provision. Each seed planted beneath cold soil was an act of faith. Each stalk that rose again was proof that God still keeps his promises. But as the years passed, we began to forget. The bread became ordinary, the grain invisible. We saw food, not faith. The ritual of gratitude turned into routine, yet every loaf still preaches. Every ear of corn still whispers that we survive only because something once died to feed us. If that truth stirs you, write "every seed remembers" in the comments. Because corn and wheat don't just feed the body. They remind the soul that all life is borrowed, and every blessing is grown from something that once surrendered. The harvest table. Before it was a holiday, it was a holy moment, a table in the wilderness. When families gathered after the harvest, they didn't see it as a feast. They saw it as a miracle. The harvest table was more than wood and linen. It was an altar, a place where people remembered that every grain, every fruit, every breath came from the same giver. In Scripture, this moment already had a name, the Feast of Ingathering, what we now call Sukkot. God commanded his people to gather what the land produced and rejoice before him. It was a celebration not of what they earned, but of what they were entrusted with. Every plate, every cup was a testimony. We are here because God provided. When the pilgrims and natives shared that first meal, they unknowingly echoed that ancient festival. A new world, yet the same divine rhythm. Sowing, reaping, remembering. They sat as strangers, but the act of gratitude made them kin. Over time, the table became ornate. Polished silver replaced simple wood. The prayer before eating turned shorter. The conversation longer. But the meaning hasn't changed. It only waits beneath the noise. The harvest table still calls us back to something older than America, a covenant of gratitude. If that thought moves you, write "I remember the table" in the comments below. Because when we gather to eat, we are doing more than feeding our bodies. We are retelling the oldest story of all, that God provides, and gratitude keeps us human. The pilgrim hat. It looks simple. Black felt, a buckle, and a brim. But for the pilgrims, the hat was never about style. It was about surrender. It represented identity, faith over fashion, purpose over pride. In a world chasing luxury, their plain clothing was a declaration. We belong to God, not to trend or title. When they crossed the Atlantic, they left behind not only homes, but an entire system that dictated what faith should look like. The hat became their banner of freedom, a quiet protest stitched in wool. Every time they placed it on their heads, it reminded them that humility was the crown of the believer. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to confess. As centuries passed, that meaning faded. The hat turned into a costume, a caricature of history. It became part of the Thanksgiving play, stripped of its sacred intent. We remembered the buckle but forgot the belief behind it. Yet the symbol still speaks. The pilgrim hat whispers of covenant, of a people who chose obedience over comfort. It calls us to wear humility again, to let faith define us more than fashion ever could. If that message resonates, write "faith over pride" in the comments, because the hat we mock as outdated was once a crown of courage, proof that the truest freedom is not in what we wear, but in whom we serve. The native headdress and feathers. Before the feathers were worn, they were earned, each one a story of courage, prayer, and connection to the Creator. Among native peoples, feathers were sacred. They weren't decoration, they were devotion. A single plume could represent years of sacrifice or a moment of divine encounter. To wear them was to carry heaven's touch upon the earth. When early settlers first saw the headdress, they didn't understand. They saw color, not covenant. What they viewed as strange was actually sacred. Feathers pointed upward, symbols of communication with the Great Spirit, of honor, protection, and balance between earth and sky. But history twisted that beauty. Feathers became costumes, stripped of meaning, used for entertainment or imitation. The headdress turned from prayer to parody, and the sacred became spectacle. What once honored unity and reverence became a reminder of misunderstanding and loss. Yet even through centuries of pain, the symbol still breathes. Today, many native voices reclaim the headdress not as nostalgia, but as healing. Its feathers remind us that reconciliation begins when we listen, when we honor what others call holy. What do you think? Can symbols once misused become bridges again? Because the feather still points heavenward, inviting every heart, native or not, to walk humbly, to listen deeply, and to remember that gratitude is empty if it forgets those who gave before us. The Thanksgiving Parade. It feels modern. Floats, music, marching bands, giant balloons. But the idea of a parade is ancient, long before Macy's or television screens. In ancient kingdoms, processions were acts of worship. People lined the streets not for spectacle but for surrender, lifting their eyes toward kings, gods, and victories that shaped their world. When America began its Thanksgiving parades, something old returned, though few recognized it. The banners, the songs, the unity of crowds walking in rhythm, they mirrored ancient processions of praise. Only this time the glory wasn't directed at thrones or idols. It was a celebration of abundance, of peace, of the simple joy that the year had survived. But as years passed, meaning blurred. The parade turned commercial. Joy turned into marketing. What began as gratitude became a stage for self. The music played louder, yet the quiet awe faded. Still, the echo remains. Every drumbeat down the city streets carries a memory of why people first gathered, to lift their eyes higher, to remind one another that life itself is a gift worth celebrating. If that thought stirs you, write "I march for gratitude" in the comments below. Because the Thanksgiving parade isn't just about balloons and fanfare. It's the modern echo of an ancient truth, that even in our noise and busyness, the soul still longs to give thanks. When the table is cleared and the noise fades, what remains isn't the food. It's the meaning. Every symbol we place around this holiday carries a whisper from the past. The turkey's endurance, the cornucopia's grace, the pie's sweetness after struggle, the grain's quiet faith, the table's covenant, the hat's humility, the feather's honor, the parade's praise. Together they tell one story. that gratitude was never meant to be a tradition once a year. It was always a way of seeing, a rhythm of the heart that turned survival into worship. The first people who gave thanks didn't have comfort. They had conviction. They looked at empty fields and still believed in tomorrow. Maybe that is the secret buried under centuries of celebration, that Thanksgiving is not about plenty but perspective. It isn't the feast that makes us grateful. It's the remembering. To give thanks is to declare that every breath, every crumb, every sunrise is undeserved grace. And perhaps that's why God commanded His people to celebrate harvests. Because gratitude keeps the heart soft. It guards us from pride, from forgetfulness, from the illusion that we made it alone. So tonight, as parades end and tables empty, listen closely. The symbols still speak. The turkey, the horn, the hat, the feather, all pointing to one truth. That abundance was never the goal, only remembrance. Because gratitude isn't what fills the table, it's what fills the soul.